The primary motivation that got me into doing this model in the first place was in my scholarly work. I've been writing about spiritual emergencies or other kinds of, really difficult challenges that come up in the process of awakening spiritual practice. And I started having people come to me and talking to me about, their experience. And so often what I heard them saying was, I'm having these really deep, profound spiritual experiences that I can't make sense of, and nobody in my community thinks they're legitimate. And I'm really confused and feeling like I'm screwing up and there's something wrong with me. But when I say, well, describe the experiences to me, and then they start talking, because of my background in comparative religions, what I'm hearing them say is something that I know some other tradition is really, really valuing and really basing their whole
Yeah.
system around.
Welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds.
Hello and welcome to the Endless Possibilities Podcast. My name is Garrett Dignam and I'm your host today for another amazing interview and podcast with another very exciting guest, Dr. Pierce Salguero. Let me give Pierce a quick introduction. Pierce is an author, researcher, teacher, fan, and critic of Buddhism, Asian medicine, and contemporary spirituality. Pierce is an expert in the global connections between Buddhism and medicine throughout history and today. For the past 20 plus years, Pierce has provided tools and support for contemporary spiritual teachers and practitioner communities who are interested in exploring the historical, philosophical, and comparative contexts of their practice. He also has a special interest in meditation sickness and other spiritual emergencies. He is the author of 3 books, A Lamp Unto Yourself, Buddhish, and A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. Pierce, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Gareth. Yeah, good to meet you. Good to be here.
Yeah, fascinating. You're friends with Luciano and Rastal, who were on the show previously. They recommended that I do an interview with you. It took us a little bit of time to get there in the end.
Yeah, yeah,
We're here.
yeah. But here we are. Yeah, thank you for your patience with me. Yeah, and Luciano's a good friend. He and I are collaborating on a research study, so I know him quite well, and we talk a lot about these kinds of things. So
Wonderful, wonderful. And we're going to do this interview a little bit differently today. We're going to talk about your model rather than you introducing yourself and talking about the stages of awakening you went through.
yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to start us
Um,
off?
well, I mean, maybe just a brief couple words of introduction might be useful for people just to understand sort of like what my perspective is and what hat I'm wearing when I talk about these kinds of things. So I like to say that I'm a fan and also a critic of spirituality because I am both a practitioner and also a scholar. So in terms of my scholarly hat that I wear, I have a PhD in the history of medicine that is focused on Buddhism and Buddhists' engagement with healing. Not only meditation, but all kinds of like ritual practices and also, monastic hospitals and other kinds of things that Buddhists have done throughout history related to health and medicine. And that also relates to contemporary Buddhist practice and its connections with health and wellness, and also the potential health dangers of engaging in Buddhist practice, which is something that I also have written a little bit about. So that's in terms of my scholarly kind of world. And then in terms of my practice, I've been very, very young. I got interested in spiritual practices, started out with Native American and very soon got into martial arts and sort of more Asian style practices. Got exposed to Buddhism in my very early 20s. Have had a 30-year yoga practice. So I kind of have like I would say like a broad base of a broad introduction to a lot of different styles of practice. And then, that kind of dovetails with my scholarly work. So I know, so I have done a lot of both practice and research in the same locations in Thailand and in China and Taiwan as well.
And you have been recently researching the stages of awakening, right?
Yeah, so I this is a project that Luciano Melo, who's been on your show, and I launched, I guess it was just about a year and a month ago, I think, that we started that from the time that we're recording. Yeah, and we are interviewing a large number of adept practitioners, people who are very, long term, who are recognized as being advanced teachers within their communities, and we're doing what we call a qualitative study of these reports about people's experiences throughout the awakening process, and we're trying to make sense of that to kind of construct maybe a model that can indicate some commonalities between different traditions, and look at where are their challenges, how do people tend to overcome them, where are there similar patterns in the kinds of experiences people have, and so forth. So that study, we're still in the data collection phase. Actually, I think we interviewed the Luciano is doing the interviews, and I think he interviewed the last person
Okay.
yesterday. And so we are going to shift now into data analysis, but we haven't done any of that yet. I haven't even seen the transcripts yet of the interviews. So we'll have to talk about the results of that later in terms of research. But my own interest in doing sort of a research project to begin with emerged out of my more theoretical interest in creating a model of, how we can think about different spiritual traditions, different forms of awakening, different kinds of experiences, how we can fit them into sort of a larger framework. And this is a framework I started developing, or a model I started developing a couple of years ago. So it's, it predates the study that I'm doing with Luciano. So the study is a little bit of maybe an empirical test to see, how well the model holds up. It'll be interesting to talk about that when we have more results.
So you created a model, and then you're sort of using the research that you've done in all the interviews to see if those people's own descriptions of the awakenings fit with your model. Is that
That
correct?
that's my personal kind of investment in
Yeah.
in working with Luciano. He's not in it because he wants to test my model. So we, as a team, we have other research interests that we're looking at. But for me, I have a more general kind of more general understanding, more general framework for understanding spirituality and the awakening process. And then, I think the interviews will, at least the way that I'm understanding the interviews is that they're contributing kind of data that I can then sort of work with to refine the model, maybe improve the model.
So I've interviewed, I don't know, maybe 50, 60 people now at this stage, and
Mhm.
I noticed that every single person's awakening is different.
That's right.
There's some, signposts that people can all agree on. There's certain shifts, but they all, and even from men to women, they seem to awaken different. Men seem to awaken through the head center first. Women are more in the heart center.
Yeah, precisely. So yes. So the problem, I think, the reason that I'm interested in working with new model is that so far I have not encountered an existing model that can account for the diversity of experiences that people actually have. And that's precisely the problem that my model is intended to start to
Okay.
try to work around. So the model is different fundamentally from, I don't claim to know every model that's out there, but in terms of the major models that people are working with when they think about awakening, this model is fundamentally coming from a different premise. And so I think it might approach things differently in a way that makes it able to accommodate the diversity of experiences that you're talking about.
Okay. Okay. I suppose maybe like that, not so many people are comfortable using a Hindu model of awakening, right? It just mightn't fit with their, their viewpoints.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in my view, the Hindu models, Buddhist models, whether it's Tibetan or Theravada or Zen, as well as kind of a lot of homegrown models that people have come up with on their own based on their own experience, they all tend to share a fundamental metaphor that's underlying all of those models. And that's the metaphor that spirituality, spiritual awakening, spiritual growth is like a path with stages.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the shared framework or shared framing, whether those stages are the 10 ox herding pictures or they're the bhumis in Mahayana Buddhism or they're stages of insight in Theravada, or I'm not sure in your model what you call these, but there's unique stages with this model that starts from an initial awakening experience and culminates, go further
Yeah.
and further and then culminates. So the so my model also is a trajectory over time. So I do think of awakening as a process that unfolds over
Okay.
time. So there is sort of a longitudinal, right, axis, a time axis to my model, but I don't carve things up in terms of individual stages. And instead, what I talk about, I sort of, instead of cutting it vertically like this, I cut it horizontally. So I'm talking about threads that run
Yes.
throughout the whole process instead of there being discrete, point A, point B, point C, D, E, F, G. Instead, there's threads that run throughout the whole awakening process. And so this allows the model to be able to accommodate, instead of having to have stages that run sequentially, the conversation can be more about trajectories of different axes or different lines of development and growth that take place during awakening. So I want to say that fundamentally my understanding of models is that they're all just models. They're all
Yeah.
just maps
Yeah.
of the territory. And the famous quote that the map is not the territory. And all maps, therefore, because they're not the territory, because they can't be the
Yeah.
actual territory, every map is going to have its strengths and weaknesses. It's going to bring certain things to light. It's going to have certain blind spots. It's going to have different advantages, disadvantages. And so I'm not saying my map is better than other ones. It's just different. So what it does
Yeah.
is just, instead of looking at things in terms of discrete stages, it looks at long-term trajectories over time, and it just brings out different facets. It has its flaws too, but one of the facets that it is able to accommodate is the extreme diversity of experience that individual people have. Because you're right, I think everybody's path looks a little bit differently.
I hope you are enjoying the show with Pierce. This is just a quick request. If you have not already signed up, please, 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 can you subscribe to our channel? It goes towards showing YouTube that we are a worthwhile show, and they push us out to new audiences through the algorithm. So if you want to continue to enjoy great conversations like the one you're watching now, please support us. Hit subscribe. Now back to the show with Pierce. Yeah, and some of the stages they overlap. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at there with the thread. It's like, you're not it's not just you're in this and that's where you are for that particular amount of time. There can be like, oh, like self-realization with, you know, unity consciousness coming in. So it's not like you're just kind of sectioned into one particular stage.
Yeah, so in terms of, the downsides to using a stage-based model,
Mm,
the downsides include the need to identify which stage you're at, right? If you have a
yeah.
model that has stages, you need to be able to identify where people are. And so there's always this, with stage-based models, there's always this kind of this struggle to position somebody in one stage. And maybe I didn't go like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I went A, C, B,
Yeah.
G, E, back to A,
Yeah.
or I mixed, A and C together, or I have a mix of like E and B together. And when people are trying to make sense of their own progress, their own trajectory, their own experience using a model like that, and they're not getting a clear picture. I mean, maybe they get a clear picture and that's fabulous, and there's no reason to choose a different model if the model that you are looking at is working for you, then great. But for people who are sort of having experiences that don't fit with this stage-based model, or
Yeah.
that are having experiences that are blended or unique and really different, this is a an alternative to just try on and see if it might make
Yeah.
help to make more sense of what's happening.
Yes. So when I was going through the awakening process, I used the TM model of awakening. And I don't know if you're familiar with David Buckland. David Buckland wrote a book called Our Natural Potential, and he mapped out 7 stages of awakening. And I was sort of using his book as I was going along, and I was saying, okay, this makes sense, that makes sense. And it, to me, it appeared like that it was linear, right? I was going this stage. And then I couldn't figure out why I experienced that non-existence before unity consciousness. And in David's book, it came after unity. So it really kind of threw me for a couple of months. I was like, I just couldn't figure it out. I was like,
Yeah.
why is that going on? So look, I'm really excited to jump into your model. Do you want to get us started on how it presents itself?
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And your experience is exactly the kind of person who I think this model might be useful for, right? Is you're looking at the model that your tradition or your teacher or your favorite book or whatever is presenting to you, and you're not really fitting into it. Then
Yeah.
what most people experience, I don't know if this was your experience, but I think most people encountering that situation start to feel something's wrong with me, right?
Mm,
My awakening process is going off the rails. I'm doing this wrong. Something's happening, that may be unhealthy, or maybe, backtracking or whatever people's anxieties are, and that can lead to just a lot of unnecessary struggle and self-doubt, and this is something that this model is, you know, explicitly trying to validate difference, validate diversity. Kind of like the underlying principle here is, human beings are not machines. We don't, nothing else in human life is clearly A and then clearly B and then clearly C, right? We're,
yeah.
we're organic animals that have,
We can be messy, right?
messy
Yeah.
processes of development. And so why would spirituality be any different than anything else, right? So, yeah,
And throw
so
trauma in there, and fear and everything else that comes
absolutely.
along with
Yeah.
being a human. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
okay, let's
Okay.
let's get started on the model.
Okay, so I have a written form of this. I'm gonna write a full length book, but I have a written form of this in about 50 pages or so of text, and it's on my website multidharma.net. And so if people are really interested in the details, there's more written than I'll be able to say here.
And
So
I'll
the
link it down below. Yeah.
Great,
Yeah.
great. And so the model is called Multi-Dharma, and the idea is that there are think in terms of threads running throughout a process of awakening, and that different threads they refer to different kind of clusters of experiences and realizations. There are different techniques that are associated with those experiences, so different threads kind of align with different techniques, and then there's different traditions that value one or another of the threads more. And so they'll sort of emphasize those techniques, they'll emphasize those experiences. And so different traditions of spirituality have different ideas about what awakening means and about what enlightenment
Yeah.
means and what we're doing here and what the goal is, based on which threads they most value or emphasize.
Yeah.
So the definition of what is awakening in the first place is something that people argue about, and people, have opinions about, and different traditions say different things. So for me, just in the most general kind of way. For me, I use the term awakening to refer to an event that takes place. It can happen instantaneously, sort of flamboyantly, very dramatically, or it can happen very slowly, kind of gradually. But it's an extraction of the individual's identity out of being completely fused into sort of the daily life, egoic, everyday self, narrative self, separate self, lots of different terms people use. So it's an extraction of your identity from being fused into that everyday self and kind of like popping out or gradually separating from, or it could be, first you're out and then you're back in and then you're out and then you're back, so it can happen and it can unfold in
Non-abiding. Yeah.
a number of different ways. But the idea is that the identity switches, from the separate self, the ego self, to some kind of other meta level self. Could be, I am awareness is an example. I am consciousness. I am God. I am emptiness. There is no self. All of these are different expressions of where that identity lands in different places. But you've extracted yourself out of the fusion with the separate self, and your identity is now placed in a different place. So that's just like my working definition of an awakening, and that can happen in what probably a lot of different ways. But my model essentially has four threads, and this would be the opening of a thread would be that event, that awakening event. So,
And what do you call it?
so the awakening can be the awakening can be the opening of what I call the thread of emptiness, oneness, energy, or psyche. And those terms I actually initially went back and forth and named and renamed because I wanted to
Okay.
choose one word, but every word I could choose would be like too loaded, and people
I
would,
was going to say loaded. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
too loaded, and people would think they knew what I was talking about. And so I just chose these words as titles, but I have like an asterisk next to every single one of them and say, it's not really what you're thinking. Like maybe it's just, I should have just called them thread one, two, three, four. But for whatever reason, I chose four words, and that's what I call them. So the initial awakening process, you will identify in 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 some way. This is that shift in identity is the opening of the thread, and then the thread is going to deepen over time, where your experience, your insight into the thread will become deeper and deeper. And a thread is a thread because it ultimately runs to the point where all of reality, all phenomena, every last thing in the universe is seen as being that thread, as seen as being in that thread's particular way. So it might be helpful to say to clarify what the four threads are.
Yeah.
But do you have a question? Should I
Well,
stop?
I'm trying to get so I think I learn or I process information a little bit differently, right? So I'm trying to get my head around the awakening and the tread, right?
Yeah.
And to understand where, like, because I mean, if you coined it, right? So you did you see this somehow? Was it something you could sense? Like, explain the tread to me. How does the tread work? Is it
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah,
This to me, this whole model came sort of like after the fact for me. It was kind of like a way that I made up to kind of account for or explain my own experience and experience of other people that I've talked to. But I also am informed by my whole background with different practices and my whole sort of scholarly, investigation of stuff too. So this model comes out of my head, and it's very
yeah,
much like how things make sense to me. So I'm
yeah,
completely prepared for it not to make sense or not to connect for people. But the four threads are, we'll take them one by one. So
sure.
emptiness. So the thread of emptiness, this is the name I give to the thread that you find throughout the awakening process, where there is a deconstruction of concepts, of identities, of phenomena. There's a deconstruction, a derealization, an emptying out, a seeing through of that.
Mm. Mm.
And so the thread might open with an experience like, oh, I previously I was this, this narrative self, but now I see through that concept, right? Or now I see through my fixation on, I don't know, my work and my everyday
Mm.
life. The concepts dissolve, the concepts are seen through, the identities are being seen through. That may be an initial experience, but then the as the thread progresses, it's the progressive seeing through of, or deconstruction of, all concepts, and what order that happens in might be very particular to an individual or particular to their tradition, but big meta level kind of cognitive objects like time, like space, like selves, of course, like reality, these concepts kind of collapse one after another. Perception, right? Like seeing objects as solid, experiencing the world in terms of, boundaries between objects, that collapses. That would also be part of the emptiness thread. Dissolution or dissolving of phenomena altogether, and kind of going into, I think you mentioned non-arising earlier, these kind of states of like cessation, like nirodha, like, all these kinds of like super concentrated states like jhanas and so forth, involve the collapse of certain types of experiences, the emptying out of certain kinds of experiences. All of that, I would say, I'm fitting all of that into this one theme of emptiness, or emptying out, or deconstruction.
Okay, so
Yeah.
just from my understanding, right? What I would say that is like the self or self-realization, and then that self-realization is like the baseline, right? So from that self-realization, all other sort of realizations can happen. And is that what you're referring to as a thread? Like that baseline self is running through then? Does
So
that make
yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Let me do the oneness thread, and then we can come
okay?
back to self, because self, the way you're using it, I'm not 100% sure of exactly what you
Okay,
mean when you say it. So
okay,
let me
sure.
differentiate the emptiness thread that I just said from the oneness thread. So the oneness thread could be the initial experience. Again, it's the self, the identity pops out of the separate self, and lands somewhere else, right? So previously it was through a deconstruction of the concept, but now the oneness thread is, it's about unity, it's about unification, it's about synthesis, or combination, right? So the separate self would pop off, because the identity shifts from, sorry, the identity pops off, the identity shifts from being glued into the separate self to some larger entity that is now greater than the separate self. So this would be like, I am awareness, I am God, I am the universe, I am everything, right? I am Brahman. And then so that's the initial awakening. And then the experience, the thread, the trajectory continues to unify everything, right? Everything it becomes part of that unity. So it's everything, all of reality is one, all of reality is God, all of reality is Brahman, whatever words people are using, whatever
Yeah.
framework. It's about adding everything. Like the first one is about subtracting things out, it's about
Netty netty,
deconstructing,
right? Not
neti
this, not that.
neti.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Okay.
this is about like and, right? It's adding, adding, adding.
Yeah.
And in both cases, both threads, so a thread is a thread, it has an opening event, it has a deepening, and then it arrives at a place where absolutely every last phenomenon in the universe is seen through that thread. So in the emptiness thread, it's, like I mentioned, cessation, nirodha, nirvikalpa samadhi, but experiences like that, where it's just like everything's gone, everything's emptied out. In in this case, in the oneness case, it's you arrive eventually. I mean, it can happen quickly, it can happen slowly, but you arrive at the end of the thread where it's everything, all
Is included.
phenomena is included without exception, right?
That
Every
makes
last
sense.
thing.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
totally with you now, right?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So my point is this: if you have a phase like model, right, where there's stage one, stage two, stage three, you might describe, this experience comes first, and then that experience comes first. But in my model, there's it's just we're just looking at threads horizontally. There's
Yeah.
these trajectories. So it might happen for me that I have an opening of my oneness thread first, and I sit in that, in my case, maybe for like, I don't know, 10 years. And then I have an emptiness thread opening. And then that goes on for like 5 years. S Somebody else, it might be like they had their oneness thread open and it was like a week. And a week later they had their emptiness thread open. Somebody else might be emptiness thread opens first and then oneness, right? It could be any number of different kind of patterns of how fast you move down the thread. It could be somebody moves really progressively and slowly. Somebody else might bounce all the way down to the end and then come back and then bounce down again and then come back. And
Hmm.
so how people experience, how and when and in what pattern and in what order people experience these threads in my model does not matter at all.
Okay. Okay.
I can, you can just think in terms of there being an emptiness thread and a oneness thread. And the awakening process is to continue down the thread to the end. Whether it happens quickly, it happens slowly, it happens, one at a time, it happens, two together,
Yeah,
doesn't
can you
matter. It's just about, moving down the thread.
and you can move down to two of them.
So so traditionally, right, you have traditions that value one of these over the other,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
this is the perennial argument between Buddhism and Hinduism is over which thread is the real one, right? So like
Yeah.
the Buddhists land on emptiness, the Hindus land on oneness.
Yeah.
They each have a little bit of the other, sometimes, but they really value one or the other of these two threads. My point is that I think individuals have kind of like an inclination towards certain kinds of experiences for whatever reason. I mean, call it karma, call it, conditioning, call it whatever. Some people are more inclined towards oneness type experiences, and some people are more inclined towards emptiness type experiences. Some people have both equally. Some people have both, but one's a little bit stronger than the other. You know, when we live in this, information age where we've got the whole internet available to us and all of these different options are out there, people are playing around with a lot of different
Yeah.
spiritual technology, different kinds
Teachings.
of teachings. They're combining things in their own way. I think that it's entirely possible for different people to have different kinds of experiences just based on, what their own inclination is. And so
Mm.
I'm, instead of saying there's like one of these threads is better than the other, or one of these is the main one and the other, all of these kinds of debates that different religious traditions have had with each other. In my view, it's just best to probably practice a little bit of both threads, see what works, see what opens up, see how it
Yeah.
happens for you, and then just like based on that, then choose techniques, choose practices that are going to help to accelerate or help to move you down the thread. And if for you that means you're doing mostly Buddhist stuff, okay, great. For somebody else, it means they're doing mostly Hindu stuff. Okay, great. For
Yeah.
somebody else, it means that they're combining the two because they're moving down both threads. Okay, great. Whatever is practical in helping you along your trajectory, I think is in my view is what is called for. It's what this model allows you to do is to combine different
Yeah.
techniques together, and you don't have to choose which tradition to belong to and believe in because it's more about taking the steps you need to move down the threads that
Yeah.
you
It's
have.
It's making a lot of sense to me because I can actually visualize it in my head. I can see the threads and I can see the two different paths. I can see one is awareness and then the other would be what I would call Shakti or fullness or unity
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And from yeah, from working with so many different people, I'm tapping into why the women are all on thread two, right? They're all going down, they're having the heart awakenings,
yeah.
oneness,
So,
and the men are on the awareness side.
yeah. So for sure, there are all kinds of differences between people that might incline you towards certain kinds of experiences, right? So I think gender is definitely a factor. It's not like black and white,
No,
but
no,
there's, there may be an influence of gender. There's influence probably in culture, in terms of culture. There's probably
yeah.
influence in terms of your age. There's also probably a lot has to do with your own upbringing and psychology and, whatever kinds of
Religious even, yeah,
psychological
yeah.
processes, religious, whatever kinds of things you've been exposed to. And just, I think we just need to remind ourselves, in terms of like modern day spirituality, that these traditions that people are inspired by are 2000 years old. They come from a time period where you had basically monoculture, right? In one place, everybody belonged to the same culture, had the same kind of, cultural ideas, social ideas. They had the same kinds of, imaginations, the same kinds of like archetypes and so forth. And now that's not the case. We live in this multi-global, multicultural, global, international, multilingual kind of context. And so everybody's got all kinds of different
Yeah.
backgrounds and exposure. And so why wouldn't it be different between people,
And
right?
probably use poetry, right, to describe some of these stages of awakening as well.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't do that anymore.
yeah. Yeah. So, right. So if you have only, let's say you just have one thread open. Let's say you're just on the emptiness thread. Buddhist tradition like Zen would be a good example of a tradition that really kind of just emphasizes like this one thread. Theravada Buddhism also mostly emphasizes this one thread. You go from emptiness experience to emptiness, like emptying out, hollowing out, seeing through one thing after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. You get to the end. You've gone through this whole process on one thread. That's fairly clear cut. It's easy to, it may be, you may encounter difficulties, you may encounter challenges, but it's easy to get advice for those challenges because you're really, if there's only one theme to your whole awakening process, you probably know who to go to talk to about those kinds of things. Right? If you're in the Zen community, you go and talk to the to the
Yeah.
meditation teacher, whatever. If you have two threads going, what I call this process braiding. So you have two threads open. It's normally the case you'll have one thread open and you'll be sort of like immersed in that thread for a while. Let's say it's like your initial experience is a oneness type experience. I am awareness. Okay, so now I am awareness for I don't know years, months, a long time. You're deepening into that thread, but then suddenly you start having emptiness type experiences, right? So now there's this other threads opened up. Initially, you might be really confused. Like, where did my oneness go? Like a minute ago, I was one with God, and now there's not only no God, there's no reality. Things are just kind of like collapsing around me, right? And the thing is, the person that was giving you really good advice about the oneness thread a minute ago is now not going to be the person who you want to talk to when all of reality collapses, right? Because these are different realizations or different types of experiences, and so there's often a kind of a disorientation that people
And they
have.
might dismiss your experience as well.
They will
Yeah.
very likely. I know this from the Buddhist side. If you go to a Buddhist teacher who's totally, steeped in emptiness and start talking to them about how you're one with God, right? They are going to see that as I mean, I read historical texts that literally call that a heresy and a demonic worldview. But
Yeah.
but in modern times, like people might not be so stark about it, but they would say, oh, that's not really, just observe that concept or see through that concept, right? They'll give you some emptiness type advice for that experience. They're not going to be able to support you in the experience itself, right? And so that can lead to you thinking, oh, I've done something wrong. Why am I having these kinds of experiences that I shouldn't be having? The other way around, you could be experiencing oneness with God and suddenly, say like in a Judeo-Christian kind of context, you're like having oneness with God experiences, and now God's gone and the whole universe is an illusion. You know, that could be problematic in your community. You go to your priest, to your Christian teacher, and tell them that God is gone and the universe is an illusion. That's not going to compute in that tradition, right? So
So, I mean, I've heard stories of people going to their teachers and being excommunicated from the
yeah,
Sangha because they had a different experience, or the teacher just, that's not my experience, so I therefore dismiss it,
that's right.
which is terrible.
Yeah, and it happens. And so one I'll tell you the primary motivation that got me into doing this model in the first place. I didn't mention this before we started. Maybe I should have, but the primary motivation for doing it was in my scholarly work. I've been writing about spiritual emergencies or other kinds of, really difficult challenges that come up in the process of awakening spiritual practice. And I started having people come to me and talking to me about, their experience. And so often what I heard them saying was, I'm having these, really deep, profound spiritual experiences that I can't make sense of, and nobody in my community thinks they're legitimate. And I'm really confused and feeling, like I'm screwing up and there's something wrong with me. But when I say, well, describe the experiences to me, and then they start talking, because of my background in comparative religions, what I'm hearing them say is something that I know some other tradition is really, really valuing and really basing their whole
Yeah.
system around, right? And so it's like your community doesn't value that, but if you just went down the street to this other community, they would be, they would be totally understanding and supportive of this. And the problem is just the context. Like people don't have the context, the broader context for their experiences, because they're limited by what their tradition is telling them is legitimate. And so then they're in this spiritual emergency that I don't think they need to be having. I think a better model in that case might be helpful.
Wow. Wow.
So that was one of the primary reasons for creating this
Okay.
model
So
in the
they're in
first
the
place.
wrong tribe, right? They're just with the wrong
Well,
people.
I wouldn't say that, because what's going to happen in this braiding process is, normally, from talking to people, what I hear is that if you have one thread open and then you have this shift into this other thread, like we just talked about, that may go on for a while. But then you may find yourself
Okay.
back in the emptiness thread and maybe back in the oneness thread. Maybe you might go through this shift multiple times. So I call it braiding. Can you, like, I think very
Yes, yes,
visually, but can you
totally,
see the
totally,
braiding of those two
totally.
together? So
Yeah,
one thread's on top. That's your primary experience at the moment. The other thread has receded into the background, but it's still kind of like active. It's still there.
yeah.
And then the next weave of the braid, that one's going to come back on top, and now the other one is in the background.
It
And
makes
so
total sense. Yeah.
yeah, and so I wouldn't necessarily say like you're in the wrong tribe. I would just say like maybe don't join a tribe, or else like join a
Or
tribe
weave in and out of
provisionally,
them. Yeah,
weave in and out of multiple tribes as necessary in order to get the support and the teachings that you need in the moment, and not like wedded to one particular worldview, like
okay.
like a like a like a fundamentalist religion.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. Wonderful.
So if we continue with this process of braiding, your both threads are moving towards the ultimate experience of seeing everything through that thread, right? So you are at some point going to experience everything is empty, and then at some other point experience everything as one, right?
Yeah.
If you have both of those threads open, you're going to wind up eventually experiencing those two alternate viewpoints of reality, right? And they're going to be like totally different kinds of like worldviews at that time, right? when you're in the emptiness, it's like everything's gone. When you're in the oneness, it's like everything's here, right? And everything's one. The the problem I think here is that many traditions create a whole view of reality and a whole view and a whole ontology about, like, meaning like a philosophy of what's real and what's not real. They create that out of these depth experiences, right, at the depth of the threads. And so you then have these traditions that are subscribing to a particular ontology that is that doesn't match or isn't able to be fit with. It's totally incommensurable with the ontology of another tradition, right? So, like, ultimately, a Hindu philosophy and a Buddhist philosophy, they really are saying the opposite thing,
Yeah.
right? It's not like, all roads lead up the same mountain or something like that. They really are different mountains. They really are saying something opposite from each other. But it's just because one is talking out of the bottom of the emptiness thread and the other one is talking out of the bottom of the oneness thread. And so my model would also suggest not adopting ontologies or worldviews based on experiences you have in your awakening process. Right. So
Okay.
just because you saw that everything is God doesn't mean that everything is God. It just means
Okay.
that's what you saw, right?
Yeah.
At that
Yeah.
time, right? Because a year later everything will be empty and God won't exist. And then, where
Yeah.
if you're creating ontologies, like, where are you then at that point? Right.
Yeah.
So
That,
better
that was
better not to.
that was my experience, right? I had some awakenings where it was like God was looking out of my eyes, and then there was no God.
That's
It
right.
completely collapsed.
That's right. That's right. So
Yeah.
this is where, I just want to underline again my model. Everything I'm saying is a map, not the territory, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's it's a it's a description of the phenomena. It's phenomenological. It's a description of how it is to experience it. It's a description of what it's like, what it feels like, not what actually is, right? I'm
Okay.
not making any claims about
Yeah.
reality, about what's real or what's not real, or right. So it's
Yeah.
just a model for how do we experience this thing that we refer to as awakening.
And a way for us to communicate about it as well, because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really important, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we all know, anybody who's had any, even like the slightest kind of spiritual experience, everybody knows you can't really put it into words because
Yeah.
the quality of the experience is to be beyond rational words and thinking concepts. So as soon as you start to use words, then you are mischaracterizing things and
It's not
leads to
it. Yeah.
misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So again, it's a map, not the territory, right? It's just a convenience for communication, for orienting yourself, for communicating. It's not an attempt to accurately define the nature of reality in any way, right?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think you've done a great job
Um,
so far,
okay,
Bruce.
all right. So let me
Amazing.
give you the
Yeah.
next piece then.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're weaving these two threads together, right? You're weaving the emptiness and oneness thread together, and you're working towards the bottom of both threads, where you see all of reality through that thread's perspective, right? At some point along the way, it could happen before you reach the bottom. It could happen after they reach the bottom. It could happen, gradually. It could happen suddenly. Different people have different experiences. But at some point, this weaving process where the threads are experienced alternately, like oscillating between them, at some point they blend together.
Yeah.
And it's at this point where you start to say things like, oh, everything is both divine and empty, right? At the same time. It sounds paradoxical. First,
Yeah.
maybe it is paradoxical, but then the paradox falls away and it's just like, yeah, that's just the way it is. Everything is both simultaneously samsara and nirvana. Everything is both simultaneously emptiness and form. Everything is both
Shiva Shakti. They
Shiva
merge,
Shakti,
right? Yeah. Yeah.
becomes the same thing and becomes inseparably the same thing. That's what I call that integration. That's when the threads have blended together so that they're inseparable from one another.
Okay. Okay. So the two threads that are running parallel braid and eventually fuse as one.
Yeah. So, like,
Okay.
imagine you're braiding. some long hair, right? And you're
Yeah.
braiding, you only have two strands, but you're
Yeah.
braiding them. And then at the end, they like, you put the hair tie on and then they combine together into one, So
Fabulous.
like
I'm
use
loving it.
that visual
Yeah.
image.
Yeah. And
Um,
have you given them colors, Pierce? In a
no, that'd be
diagram?
great.
No. Okay.
That'll
Okay.
be great.
Okay.
I would love to give them colors. Maybe that's what I should have done. The red, yellow, green,
Red
and
and blue or yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So that's the kind of basic overview of two threads.
Okay.
My model has
Four.
four and then maybe five threads.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so do you wanna like
Absolutely.
ask me
Yeah.
any question or anything before I move
No,
on to
I
those
think
or
you've totally nailed the first two. For me, it's crystal clear. Really
okay.
amazing. Yeah.
Okay. So if that's clear, then let's talk about two more spiritual threads. So the next one is the thread of what I call the energy thread. So some traditions will focus on this type of awakening and focus on this type of practice. Some traditions will really value this and have a lot of support around the energy thread. So the energy thread is not like acupuncture and Reiki and stuff like that. That's energy work, which is great for
Mm.
being healthy and healing and so forth. But remember, in order for it to be a thread, there has to be this awakening process, which is the shift in identity, right? The shift in identity to the thread, and then the deepening of the thread, and then seeing the whole universe as the thread. So I'm not saying that can't happen to a Reiki practitioner through Reiki, but that's not usually what people are talking about when they're talking about Reiki or acupuncture or other kinds of health modalities. The the place where you most often do hear something like this is when people are talking about Kundalini awakenings, but it also is within Taoist context. They talk about energetic awakenings as well. So it's the extraction of the identity from the narrative self, and it goes to like I am energy, or what I previously thought of as me is actually this like fountain of energy. It can be there's
Right.
energy in my body, but then the body itself becomes energy. The separation between inside and outside disappears, and the whole field is energy. Phenomena that previously were solid or turn out to be like fluttering energetic, have this kind of fluttering energetic quality to them until it's like every last particle in the universe is just fizzling, bubbling with energy. There's nothing solid left in the universe. Even my consciousness isn't solid viewing the fluctuations. My consciousness itself is pulsating,
Yeah.
and then
Aliveness.
it's total
Yeah.
aliveness. And then
Yeah.
it's like these little fizzles of energy don't even they can't even come into existence. They're just potential. They're gone before they're here. The whole thing, all of reality
Like
is,
fizzing bubbles, right? It's
yeah,
like,
like fizzing bubbles that don't
yeah.
even that pop before
Yeah.
they form or something like that. All of reality is just this alive dance of little popping
This
champagne
is
bubbles.
my thread, Pierce.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and that's different. So that's a different kind of like quality to saying everything is one. So
Yeah.
the thing is all of these threads end with non-duality. They end with non-separation because the last thing to go is like the viewer, the consciousness that's viewing the thing, right? So like I am conscious of the emptiness, right? Of the
Yeah.
void, or I am conscious of the totality of God, or I am conscious of energy, right? That's still a duality all the
I'm
way to
one.
the end.
I am one with everything. Yeah.
I am
There's still an I. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
one with everything. As long as there's still that I, the
It,
thread isn't finished.
it's not
The,
non-duality yet. Okay.
yeah. So the thread finishes when that last separation is gone, and it's just like there's yeah, words fail, but there is absolutely nothing in the universe that is separate from this fizzing pulsation of energy, right? Or
Okay.
yeah, so that would be the end of the energy thread.
Okay.
And then the last thread that is, probably the most complicated, so I save it for last, or the one that is most
I
readily
think I know what's coming though, right?
misunderstood.
Yeah,
Oh, you do? Okay.
I think I
Um,
do. Yeah,
so this is the psyche thread, and psyche is a word that has like a bazillion different kinds of meanings.
yeah.
And here I'm just really trying to say this is like the sum total of all of the conditioning and unconscious material, all of it, including the body, including the shadow material, including all of your cultural conditioning, all of your traumas, all of your ancestral genetic inheritance, your social environment, like every single last shred of conditioning or karma or unconscious material that's shaping who
Yeah.
you are and how you speak and how you think and every other facet. So there can be really powerful awakening experiences there too. So this thread tends not to be prioritized so much in Asian traditions as a pathway for awakening. Often I find that, I mean, at least from my readings in historical materials, Asian traditions are often a little bit dismissive of this material as being sort of like the baggage that you need to purify in order to get back to your real awakening, which is actually over in the emptiness thread or over in the oneness thread. And this is kind of like a sideshow. Like it just needs to sort of be processed so that you can relieve yourself of this karma and then get back to, what really matters. But I think that's actually quite potentially damaging and short-sighted. So I looked at traditions like Jungian psychology is a good one. This I think shamanism, a lot of indigenous traditions would fit under here. And this would be the initial awakening experience is something like, again, separating out of the separate self and just realizing that what you previously took to be the separate self is now being viewed from a larger meta level place. And in this case, people will talk really, all kinds of different ways about this, but something like, I'm realizing I'm a soul, like I'm realizing I'm a part of the, like I'm part of like a kind of a world soul or Gaia or something like that.
Okay, okay,
Or it can be very sort of like psychological, like internal family systems is a good example where you sort of like separate out, and they call this the self that sees the parts, right? So that's another kind of extracting yourself out. For a lot of people, this is something about past lives. Like I'm a soul that's been through various different incarnations, and now
okay,
I'm in this body. A lot of indigenous traditions talk about ancestors, right? And seeing like I'm not just me. I am my entire ancestral lineage that's here through me. Some forms of shamanism. It's you have to develop you see like a spirit self or a soul self, like as a distinct entity that now operates in a spirit world. Lots and lots of different specific kind of ways that manifests, and I'm more interested in the generalities than the specifics. So in general, I would say what the psyche thread is about is just discovering deeper and deeper and deeper into the thread. You just discover how much of your reality is a projection of your conditioning or is like shaped by your conditioning
okay.
and conditioning at all levels.
So are you talking about your free will awareness unit, right? Like, so, so the threads that we just talked about is like the awareness wake into the reality of itself. But then there seems to be another aspect of the like the soul, like a beingness that sort of has
Mhm.
free will. It can make decisions. Is that what you're describing? Like a spark of the divine that's kind of encapsulated with the self or the soul?
Yeah, I mean that could be your way of expressing
Okay.
it.
Okay.
The specific terminology for this one is so variable
Okay.
that it kind of escapes clear succinct definition. I have to sort of like paint a broader
Okay.
picture. but the idea is just that more and more and more of who I am, what I say, what I do, what I think comes to be clearly I come to realize clearly how that is just a product of my conditioning, whether it's my trauma, if you're going from a psychological standpoint, it's my trauma, it's my early childhood, it's how I was shaped by my early experiences. But beyond my own biography, it's how my culture has shaped me, how my ancestry, how my genetics, how about how my body, how much of who I am is conditioned by the fact that my body is male, by the
Okay.
fact that I'm a mammal. I
Yeah.
experience reality in a certain way being a mammal that's different than how I would if I was a fish, right? And just like seeing how much of our experience is a it's not an objective external reality, but it's actually just all being constructed and projected through this conditioning out into the world. So realizing that, you start to be able to see how you're kind of like co-creating reality. There's so much of it is a projection of your conditioning, that then some people start to have, psychic powers, or like siddhis, the ability to kind of, change reality in different ways. Whether they are quote unquote actually or not is an ontological question, but inside this thread, you will feel like you are able to, have these kinds of powers. You'll feel, that you're able to communicate with past lives, or with ancestral spirits. A lot of spirit entity type interactions, a lot of, dream work,
Okay.
visions.
Yeah.
This whole sort of like, imaginal world opens up with all of these different kinds of experiences.
So the astral.
So some people will talk about astral, some people will talk about, different sub subterranean, underworlds and heavens, all of that.
Yeah.
All of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I'm going to call all of that the psyche thread. And
Okay.
I'm gonna say that there's often an initial opening experience where you realize, oh, I thought I was this separate self, but now I see that I'm really blah blah blah, right? Whatever that blah 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 is, and then you deepen into this thread slowly or quickly, one step at a time, or bouncing back and forth or whatever, but the thread deepens and deepens and deepens until, just like the other threads, you see every last experience in the
Okay.
universe is actually a construct that I have created and projected
And it
out.
collapses?
Well, like all the other threads, when you get to the bottom, it's like there is nothing left that's not a
Okay.
projection of my own
Okay.
making.
Okay. You're making perfect sense. It's totally fitting in with my experience. Okay.
Okay. So how you experience that thread, and the language you used, and the symbols that came to you, and all whatever unfolded is unique to you, I'm sure. There may be other people that shared like certain aspects of it. Like, did you have a divine being that had light coming out of its head at some point, emerged, from your heart or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that? A lot of people do
Yeah.
have similar
Yeah.
similar experiences from working with this material. I think because there's probably some of it is like archetypally biological, some of it's maybe deeply, deeply cultural, but but
Yeah.
but but we're so different as humans and exposed to so many different influences that the specifics of how that happened for you are almost certainly going to be quite different than the specifics of how it happened to me. But we can say, generally speaking, what happened
Yeah.
was the emergence of all of this material that needed to be either released or welcomed. It needed to be healed, or it needed to be embraced. And little by little, or all of a sudden, step by step, I came to see that all of reality is a projection of my own making.
Okay. Okay. So I had that thread before the other threads. I had all the psychic phenomena, out of body experiences, lucid dreams
Yeah.
before awakening. But then it also sort of ran along the other threads as I was going through them. but eventually ceased.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in my model, it may be that that was the first thread to open for you,
Yes.
and then
Yes.
you were braiding it
Yes.
with the other threads,
Yeah.
and eventually. So here's the thing. So we talked about braiding earlier. Earlier we were saying two threads, but actually
Yeah.
now it's like four threads
Four
intertwining.
threads. Yeah.
So like sometimes, throughout this awakening process, however long it took, like sometimes emptiness is in the ascendant, sometimes oneness is in the ascendant, sometimes it's all about the energetics, and sometimes it's all about the psyche, the psyche material. And they're all kind of like intertwining in unique ways that are specific to you in your own time, in your own way. You deepen through those four threads, and then you eventually come to the place where they start to integrate, where they start unifying together. So we said earlier, this is the point where people start talking about, oh, emptiness is form and form is emptiness, or everything is divine and also empty at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, if you have four threads running, eventually you're likely to say something like reality is totally divine, totally empty, completely, alive with energy, and also a projection of my own making
Yeah. Yeah.
simultaneously.
Yeah. Okay. You said there was possibly a fifth thread?
Okay, so the kind of fifth thread
Yeah.
is just ordinary daily
Human
life,
existence. Yeah.
human existence, right? This thread is like maybe it's always there from the beginning. It's not really an awakening thread. It's kind of like most people say, oh, this is the thread you awaken from, right? That's kind of like what they mostly think. But the daily life is braided into the other threads in such a way that when you're in an awakening process, there are times where you're totally absorbed into oneness or emptiness, and then there's times where that recedes and you're just like dealing with work, and you're dealing with, paying the bills, with problems with the kids, with the pets, with the car, with, just ordinary kinds of concerns come to the foreground. And many people go through this kind of initial experience where they're like, where did my awakening go? Everything's so like normal now. And there's this braiding process, that earlier on. But as you move down towards integration, this thread gets integrated too. So I might say something when I'm deep in integration, I might say something like, I see that I am God, and I am also the void, and I am also, this energetic being, and I'm also a soul, but I am also just an ordinary person, right? Just an ordinary
Yep.
little old me going to work. Or
Yep.
you might phrase it differently. Those are just words, that some people might use. So somebody else might say, I'm the whole universe is empty, and the whole universe is totally empty, totally divine, totally energetic, totally a projection of my mind. But then I'm also just a human being
Totally
doing
human
my
at the
thing,
end.
totally human.
All phenomena just seems to stop existing, right? Or anything, and just to come back to Luciano and Rastal, when I interviewed the two of them, I had come up against this brick wall that I wasn't finding answers to. And I was like, everything seems to have stopped. I can't
Oh
find,
yeah.
yeah, I couldn't find, before I could meditate, I could ask questions and I could have visions and phenomena. And then all of a sudden, it was just like, it's all gone. And it
Yes.
wasn't until I was talking to the guys where they said, "Oh, that's something we coined, this Omni Integration," and it made a lot of sense to me. It's like I now it's fully integrated, therefore I cannot find an experience outside of myself. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
So their model has stages, and so
Yes.
we think a little bit, or might talk a little bit differently, but we have compared notes, Luciano and I, in detail for years now, and we have a lot of agreement
Yeah.
on most things. So their notion of omni integration, I also use the word integration to talk about the kind of the fusion of these five things together. so when you're fully kind of experiencing reality through all of these perspectives simultaneously, that sort of totally integrated stage that they call omni integration, I just see that as like the completion of this integration process, right? The braiding led into integration, which now has completed. And then I think what you were describing is what I would talk about as releasing the threads. So this is the final kind of like process. And again, it's not a stage, it's a process that unfolds over time. But once you have integrated the viewpoints, the frameworks, the perspectives, they all integrate together. Yeah, you said they become so integrated that every last thing has been integrated into it. Every last separation has been integrated to the point that there's now no longer a separated
Yeah.
viewer to see that things are integrated, right? The last kind of
Yep.
like shred of a monitoring function or like a presence or
Yep.
some kind of separate witness, even a super thin, super fine, subtle witness has been integrated in. When every last shred of that has been integrated in, the thread is I say the thread is released. And what I mean by that is all of the viewpoints and perspectives and experiences and abilities and ontologies that and worldviews and every last facet of that thread just ceases to be noticed or even cared about any longer, and
Yeah, you
it's
don't care.
just
You don't care.
dropped.
You just
it
don't care.
it's just dropped. And so if you drop all four of these threads, what you result with is somebody who cannot tell if they're awakened or not, and that doesn't care.
So a couple of months ago, I had this experience where there was an awakening from the whole awakening experience collapsed.
Yeah,
And I was like, there was never even an awakening. I felt like a complete phony. I was like, what am I even doing talking about awakening?
yeah,
Like, there was never an awakening in the first place. That's
yeah.
what it felt like.
Yeah, I mean, what you see at that point is that each one of the threads, as magnificent as they were, and they're magnificent. There's no doubt
Yeah,
about it. They're
yeah,
magnificent, but as magnificent as they were, they each represent an overlay or an interpretation or a framework
yeah,
on reality. And if you think back to the beginning when I said an awakening is you go from being fused into the separate self, and then you extricate yourself from that into some kind of meta level self. So now you can see that self could have been I am energy, I am a soul, I am God, I am, the spirit in the astral plane, I am I am emptiness, I am not a self. There, you could have popped off into any number of different
mm,
positions or points or perspectives of identity that you separated off into, possibly multiple ones, possibly like moving around between them, right? Then they all become fused together. They might get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, but you're still, no matter how thin this separation is, no matter how subtle the separation is, if you're seeing reality or seeing, yourself and your actions, or seeing phenomena from a perspective of any kind, you're separated from
yeah,
those phenomena, right?
yeah,
So you're in a meta level of self. So this meta level gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and then it just kind of like pops, or it kind of like disappears. And what you're left with is you've extracted the identity out of the separate self, and that's it doesn't go back, right? You've extracted the identity, the witness, the consciousness, the awareness, whatever, out of the separate self, and
And
now
it
it
just pops.
disappears.
It just
It
pops.
just pops, and what you're left with is just like, I, it's hard to say, but you're left with just things happening without
Happening.
really needing to be, without being monitored, without being observed, without being really like
Sense of
actively
doership. Yeah.
managed. There's no sense of doership. There's no sense of ownership. There's no sense of identity, but neither is there a position of non-doership or
Yeah.
non-identity. That's not there either, because that would
No.
just be a perspective too. To say, oh, there is
Yeah.
no self is to take a perspective on the self. So there's just no perspective taking being really being done. Or if it's done for purposes of communication, there's no belief or ontology behind it. So, you could ask me, a question about, I don't know, myself, that would require me to take a position on something, but there's no like belief system or kind of like ontological commitments or philosophies behind it. It's just like a way of talking. And life just sort of like, I call it autopilot. Life just kind of like goes on
Yeah.
autopilot. Like things just happen, things just are done. There isn't a lot of, reflection and commentary and management, micromanagement of things. They just, things just
Yeah.
flow along,
Just
and it's just kind of like
click
normal. And
click into place, and you just yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's very super, super, super normal, super, super, super simple.
Yeah.
All the bells and whistles of awakening are gone. All of anything that you
Yeah.
could call awakening is gone. And but so is that process of identification with the narrative self, like that doesn't come back. That's gone permanently. So
And as you say, like like, nor do you care about it anymore.
yeah.
Like you don't go, oh, like y- y- one of the things I get a lot is people say, oh, did you read this book or do you read that book? Or you're like, well, what? I don't. There's no point in me reading it. It's like, why would I want to try and go back and learn about the stages of? I kind of refer to it as like it's like a whole load of toddlers asking an adult how they became an adult, and the adult going, well, God, I never actually really thought about it. I just kind of found myself as an adult one day, and I never really looked back over that. So it's like it's just something that happens, and then you don't really reflect back on it.
Yeah, yeah. You're not there monitoring it while it's happening, formulating ideas and
Yeah,
notions as it goes, right? So somebody can draw your attention to it afterwards, and
of
then you're like, oh
course.
yeah, yeah, I guess that did happen. I wasn't really paying attention. It's kind of like I think it's rather similar to like a flow state. I don't know if you've heard
Yeah,
about this, like, like athletes get into a flow state, or some,
yeah,
artists or musicians or whatever get into a flow state, and then you can say like, what were you thinking when you like did that amazing thing that I just saw? And they're like, I don't know, I kind of like wasn't even really there.
yeah,
I don't know how it happened, it just happened, right? Like that's kind of like all of life is just sort of like that. Things just sort of happen, and and there's nothing really special about it, right? There's nothing.
yeah. But
Yeah.
yet I'm sat here having one of the best conversations that I've ever had and finding it totally fascinating that you've mapped all of this out and your model just made so much sense. Like in the beginning, I was like, okay, how did the threads work? But then as you started to describe it and you were using the braiding, it was like, oh, this is probably the best model I've come across.
Well,
Amazing.
it has its, like all models, it has its benefits and its shortcomings, right? So it's definitely, it has blind spots, right? So, the model is cut differently than the stages, so it's
Sure.
gonna it's gonna be blind to stages. It's going to be blind to, I mean, one easy objection would be from people who are very committed to one of these threads over the others. They're going to say this model is, bogus, which is probably like 95% of people. So, it's got advantages and disadvantages, but if you're beating your head against these stage-based models and not able to really make them fit your experience, then, I would say like try it on and see, like think in this way and see if it works. And
Uh,
if it does, then great. My only goal in putting this out is to sort of like help people to like I said, one of the main goals is to help people avoid thinking they're doing something wrong and really
Yeah.
kind of like getting into some trouble with that. But the main, I mean, the only goal is just to empower people to be able to understand their own process. That's the whole point. So,
Amazing. And you wrote a book on it? Is the book out?
I have 50 pages written. They're up on the website multidharma.net for people to read for free. I'm selling a PDF there for $10 just to help to finance the website and so forth. And this is a preview of a book that I'm in the process of writing that will, take time because books take time, but I'm doing it as fast as I can. Hopefully get it out soon. So that
Amazing.
book will the 50-page PDF and website is kind of the written version of what I've been talking about here. It
They
describes
can
things in
get an
detail.
overview of the model.
The
Yeah.
whole model is
Yeah.
described there from beginning
Okay.
to end. The book version, as I expand it, will have more kind of like examples and more clarifications and so forth. But the core is there and it's written. And
Okay.
the other thing I should say is I think your listeners are probably would probably enjoy going straight to the multi-dharma
Yeah.
to the model. But the website also has a beginner book which is written, which is published. It came out just a couple days ago, official publication date. And that is, the book's called A Lamp Unto Yourself.
Yeah.
And it's a book for really for beginning in an interest in spirituality, getting into spirituality for the first time, or it could be somebody who's maybe very familiar with one narrow corner of spirituality that wants to get sort of an overview of the rest. But it's sort of like, the introduction to spirituality based on the principles that I've been talking about of multi-dharma. So I didn't have the language. I wrote the book a couple of years ago. I didn't have the threads language, so it doesn't specifically say threads, but if you look at it, it's basically it's an introduction to Asian spiritual practices and basically focuses on the first three threads plus daily life. So it's got, three and a half
Wonderful.
out of the 4.5 threads.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
so that's there.
I'll link to all your books down below, your web. You have a couple of different websites, right?
Yeah, I have my academic website is puresalguero.com.
Yeah.
That has my like academic research and stuff on there.
Okay.
But yeah, multidharma.net is the one with this material.
And you're open to coming back for another interview about the research if we can get
Yeah,
Ciano on board.
I think it'd be great. Luciano and I can come back.
Yeah.
Give us, I don't know, give us 6 months to get
Okay.
the data analysis and everything together.
Wonderful.
But yeah, that would be, I think it would be lovely.
I can't
Enjoy
wait.
talking with you, and I think
I can't wait.
it'd be great to
Yeah.
for us to present that together.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Pierce. You've been incredible. The detail and the clarity, describe. I was in heaven listening. Thank you so much. Honestly, it
Well,
was
it's fun.
amazing.
Yeah. Well,
It
thanks
was a
for
lot of
the
fun.
opportunity to talk about it because, yeah, I feel like it's a little complicated. It's a little bit sort of a challenge to kind of talk through it all very rapidly, but appreciate having the
You
time to
did
do it.
great. You did great. Thank you so much. Thank you to the viewers and listeners as well. Thank you, everybody. Pierce, take care.
Yeah. Cheers.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
This has been the Endless Possibilities Podcast, where the journey of spiritual awakening and energy healing unfolds. Garrett is a lifelong seeker of truth, a spiritual teacher and author, and it's his passion to delve into the profound world of consciousness. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we hope you've gotten something from it. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, the podcast is available on YouTube and all the major podcasting platforms. Find us on Instagram at _mother_force. Take care, and we'll see you soon on the Endless Possibilities Podcast.